over to Dr. Caren Heller for our IBD research update on precision nutrition. Caren?
Thanks, Harriet. Thanks, Mike. I'm always delighted to come back and present to the volunteers and the chapter presidents. I do regret that we need to do it virtually this year, because it is always fun for me to be there and see you and interact, and really thank you personally for all that you do to enable me and my team to do our work. So always really so appreciative of all the work that you do and the resources you generate for us, because we can't be here. I can't be here without you. And so I am really, really grateful. So I am delighted to be here and to really be talking about how we're driving impact through our new effort in precision nutrition. And wait, no, I'll say the next slide. So just hold on one second. I have a couple of things to say first. So, we know that it's really important to patients and to answer the question, what should I eat? Because when you're diagnosed with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, really one of the first questions is, what should I eat? And when we think about that answer, so we've been thinking about how at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, how we can advance knowledge to be able to answer that question. And so a couple of points to keep in mind when think about answering that question, there are really two parts of that question. One is, what should I eat so I can maintain a healthy nutrition? And we've been focused on that for a long time now, for 5 or more years. I've been at the foundation now 7 years. So pretty early on, we've been thinking, how do we get you the educational resources? And I will sort of go into all of the resources that we have about nutrition. So really focused on, okay, how can I be healthy nutritionally from what I eat? The second question, which is also really important, is, can food be a part of my therapeutic approach, how I treat my IBD? And we know that that's really important, and the slides that I'm going to review, and then when we hear from Dr. Rahman and Gerasimides, we're really going to hear more about, can diet really be part of your approach to managing your IBD? But I want to emphasize that food is only a part of managing your IBD. That most people, even if they eat healthy and eat the right foods and do what they need to do, will probably still need medications to treat it. So we need to think about sort of the balance overall of how you're going to manage your IBD. And today we're going to focus in on the food, but let's keep in mind that's one component of an effective way, effective treatment regimen, sort of how you're managing your disease. Great. Okay, so next slide. So I've always wanted to say publicly, you are what you eat. And now I have lots of information that's going to substantiate that comment. So I'm very excited about that. Why can't I eat what other people are eating? I've had that thought for years. And thinking about these two questions, then how do we really get to the answer of what you should eat to be healthy? And since we're still a few years away from answering that question to the level we want to, okay, then what should I think about now in terms of what I should eat now if I have Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis? So next slide. You are what you eat, and I hope nobody out there has this hot dog right now. Okay, next slide. So food is really at the center of IBD pathology. And I say that because we know that there are basically 4 pillars when we think about the underlying factors that influence Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. There's the genetics. Some people have genetic changes that make them susceptible to the disease. Then there's the microbiome. What is going on in your gut that is influenced by the genetics and influences your GI tract, and whether it's healthy or whether it has changes that are, prone to disease, and influences also the immune response. So we know that, of course, the immune response is central to people with IBD because they have an abnormal immune response and they have a lot of inflammation. We also know that environmental factors really play a key role. We don't have the data yet to demonstrate that they triggered the disease, but it's possible that they do. And we know that food is a key element of an environmental trigger because we all need to eat. And so we know that food really has an interplay with each of these three main factors that influence whether someone will get IBD and how that disease is going to, they'll experience that disease. So, for example, with genetics, we know that the genes, and here I'm not talking about genes like brown hair and blue eyes, but the genes that really underpin how your body works at the molecular level influence how you handle food. And in reverse, food can actually influence which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off. Similarly, with the microbiome, the organisms in your gut really influence how the food is metabolized and which products that come from the food interact with the lining of your gut. And similarly, food influences the kind of organisms that live in your gut. And we know that changing your diet will eventually change your microbiome makeup. So those are very much interplay there. With immune response, we know that your immune response, your immune cells influence your response to food. For example, some people have food allergies. It isn't so clear yet, but there's some indication that food actually might influence the immune response. It certainly influences inflammation, and it's thought that there are pro-inflammatory foods and anti-inflammatory foods. So next click. And so essentially, you really are what you eat, certainly in IBD, and we know that that is true, becoming ever more apparent with other kinds of diseases and what you eat. Next slide. So why can't I eat what they're eating? So everybody, I'm sure, looks at other people eating donuts and cake and ice cream and never putting on weight and thinking, oh my God, why isn't that me? So let's explore that. Next slide. It's because everyone has a personal response to food, basically because, as I said, we have these three major characteristics: your microbiome, which is unique to you, your genetics, which are unique to you, and your immune response as a result of food that you take in. And then we have that added factor of physical activity. And I'm sorry to say that physical activity is important in influencing how you respond to food. And physical activity, exercise, but just in general, physical activity. And all of these characteristics together, which are unique to you, influence your clinical response to food and the setting of having Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. Next slide. So how do we, knowing how unique people's responses are to food, how do we get to personalized diet recommendations for people living with IBD? Next slide. So we know the goal is to answer the question, what should I eat to manage or to help manage my IBD? Because I want to reiterate that this is part of your whole therapeutic approach and the medications you need to be on and all other aspects of how you're managing your IBD, which you work out with your provider. But this is also a key element because everybody needs to eat. So the goal is that we know that patients with IBD want to choose foods that are beneficial for them. We know that the challenge is that each person responds differently, often to the same food. So the solution is, can we find a way to measure your personal response to food, feed that information back to you, no pun intended, and then allow you to choose the food that is really best for you? Next slide. So the way we need to do that is we need to be able to measure your response on two different levels. One is on the molecular level, as I mentioned, on the impact on the microbiome and vice versa, on the impact on the genetics, on the immune response and inflammation, which all leads to sort of the impact of food on the lining of the gut. And then we need to see how all of that gets interpreted in your actual clinical response, looking at symptoms, looking at lab tests such as C-reactive protein, fecal calprotectin, and then ultimately at endoscopy. Is the food, is the diet you're on really helping to get to remission and endoscopic healing? Next slide. So this is the goal of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation Precision Nutrition Initiative. Next slide. We launched this in 2019. We put out an RFP thanks to the generosity of Dr. Jonathan Rose, who enabled us to fund projects. Next slide. And we were able to fund, with his funding and other funding, 4 projects. You will be hearing from Dr. Rahman from the University of Calgary in Canada, and Dr. Gerasimides from the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll have Dr. Lee and Dr. Knights and Dorenstein present their work as well. Next slide. And so what we try to do with funding for the Precision Nutrition Initiative, especially because we had generous donors that enabled us to fund 4 projects, is to fund projects that really gave us, or giving us some answers to pieces of the puzzle that will help us put this puzzle together to more quickly advance to our ultimate goal of really helping you understand what you should eat. And the 4 components that we're funding are an understanding of, can we identify through biomarkers, which are measures in the blood or their stool primarily, or they could be in the gut, how are there biomarkers that we can identify that can help us predict which patients are likely to respond in which ways to certain food? That's a key thing to be able to predict who's going to have which response to, let's say, dairy or fiber. Then Dr. Gerasimides will be talking about triggers of relapse. Like, once you're feeling good, what should you eat to ensure that you stay feeling good, as opposed to foods that might trigger you to start going out of remission and feel bad. And then we're also looking for ways to do personalized predictions by using actually big data and artificial intelligence. And so the project by Dr. Dorenstein and Knight really looks at the data out there, and then, believe it or not, there's a lot of data on the kinds of metabolites or products that are derived from food. So when you eat food, lots of things happen to it during as it goes through your gastrointestinal tract, and it yields different kinds of products called metabolites, and a lot of that is known in common databases. So they're really taking an artificial intelligence to big data approach to this. And ultimately, what we're hoping is, with all of this information, that we can come up with diets that are based on these evidence, and then test out these anti-inflammatory diets through randomized controlled trials. And Dr. Rahman and Dr. Lee are doing that already. And you will hear Dr. Rahman's approach as well in the next presentation. And so hopefully when we get the answers to this puzzle, we will be able to sort of answer the question we're seeking. Next slide. And so really, because the ultimate goal, as I said, is taking all the things we know about you and what we now will learn about your response to food, we're actually able to then give personalized diet recommendations. And I don't think it's that far-fetched to think of all this happening on your cell phone. So we're very excited about this. But next slide. This isn't going to happen for a while. So how do we address the question, what should I eat now? Next one, next slide. And so, as you know, we supported along with PCORI, and Dr. Lewis contributed the money he received personally from the Sherman Award to this study on a diet to induce remission in Crohn's disease study called DINE-CD. And we now have answers from this study. Was a randomized controlled trial, and it compared the specific carbohydrate diet to the Mediterranean diet, and you can see the characteristics of those diets on this slide. It was a 12-week study where one group was randomized to the specific carbohydrate diet and the other to the Mediterranean diet. And it enrolled patients with mild to moderate Crohn's disease. And for the first 6 weeks, they actually had a caterer, if you will, deliver the actual meals for them and their family so that they were all really sticking to these diets. And then the 7 to 12 weeks, if they had been the specific carbohydrate diet, they stayed on that, but they prepared their own foods, and similarly with the Mediterranean diet. Next slide. And the results basically showed that there was symptomatic improvement or what's clinical remission in about 40 to 45% of patients. So these are patients who had symptoms, were on a stable regimen of medications, but they still were not controlled on that medication regimen. They had symptoms, and about 40 to 45% of them improved symptomatically on these diets. We didn't really see a response in markers of inflammation, for example, C-reactive protein. So we know that the diets help them feel better, and but neither really help control their disease from an inflammatory point of view. And so the conclusion is that since both diets were well tolerated, despite the consumption of increased fruits and vegetables, that patients with Crohn's disease in the situation, mild to moderate, who are still having symptoms could really think about these kinds of diets. And if you think about what's a healthier diet, the Mediterranean diet is really healthier in terms of lots of other diseases and sort of future well-being. So one might really want to think about that since it did as well as a specific carbohydrate diet. Next slide. And then finally, I also want to tell you about the information we have available on diet and nutrition for adults and for children. The slide is on adults. And you can see we have a lot of topics on IBD diets, food selection. Now we're talking with the vitamin and mineral supplementation, nutritional support therapy, and malnutrition, really going back to that first point that I mentioned, that diet helps in 2 ways to make sure you're nutritionally healthy, as well as to address issues about managing your disease. So we have a lot of information primarily about how to stay nutritionally healthy, because that's where we know a lot more right now. And we have multiple formats, so webinar, animated videos, brochures, and you can get to this from our diet and nutrition landing page. Next slide. And then finally, we have resources for pediatrics. And the major topics here are really how to address misconceptions about diet and nutrition for IBD patients, particularly children and teenagers, and then how to empower pediatric patients to learn more about nutrition and their disease, because they have to have ownership of their diet. So they really need to understand what are the key concepts and how to implement that. And again, we have different formats. We have videos, we have IBD Nutrition Equation, which is in English and Spanish, Talking Trish video series, and then we have web resources. And you can get to that through our main parent youth link on our website to get to the pediatric nutrition resources. So next slide. Once again, I want to thank you. These continue to be exciting times at the foundation as we move forward with greater impact and really moving into pioneering areas that no one else is funding. And so if it's not us, it's nobody. And so we are so delighted that you are enabling us to have the resources to let us do that. So I want to thank you so much for your support to get here. And then I know to stay on time, we are going to move forward. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Maitreya Raman from the University of Calgary. Dr. Raman is a gastroenterologist and physician nutrition specialist at the University of Calgary, and she's going to share the research that we are funding in precision nutrition. So Maitreya.
So thank you very much, Dr. Heller, for that very kind introduction and also that fantastic background. So I'm going to share my slides. Okay, do you see the slides? So I'm going to talk to you today about precision nutrition and its application in inflammatory bowel disease. Sorry, I'm just unable. Okay. Here we go. So the objectives of today's talk are to describe the emerging frontier for diet as primary therapy in IBD, discuss the concept of personalized nutrition, and discuss the emerging research, particularly from our group in the field of personalized nutrition. So I'd like to start by sharing this slide with you. And to build on Dr. Heller's previous point, we see that there likely is a strong environmental contribution towards the development of inflammatory bowel disease. The first case of ulcerative colitis was first diagnosed in the 1850s during the mid-industrial revolution. And then over the course of the next 100 years, there was a significant rise in the incidence of IBD, particularly in the Western world. In the mid-1950s, we see the first case of ulcerative colitis reported in China. And over the course of the subsequent 70 years, we've seen a rapid rise in the incidence of IBD, particularly in newly industrialized countries, whereby IBD was infrequently or rarely observed in these more pre-industrialized countries. Now, what's really interesting is that as we see the rise of inflammatory bowel disease, we see that there is a parallel change in the globalization of dietary patterns. If you look at the far left, the pre-industrial diet is one that historically or traditionally has been rich in plant-based foods, in unprocessed foods, minimal food additives, large fiber intake, and optimal fatty fish and omega-3 to 6 ratios. But we see over the past 50 to 70 years, the dietary patterns globally have changed significantly. Now we're seeing a greater reliance on more processed foods, on fast foods, higher animal-based proteins, different types of fat, and different types of fat consumption. So the Western diet, as otherwise known, has really extended globally. Now, this has paralleled the rise in the global incidence of IBD. Now, when we look at the determinants of the bacteria in the gut, or otherwise known as the gut microbiome, we see that there is this dysbiosis or an alteration of the gut microbiome in patients with inflammatory bowel disease. Now, whether this dysbiosis of the bacteria is a consequence of the disease or a cause of the disease is still yet unknown. However, we know that diet does interact with the microbiome and can modify and shape the gut microbiome in many possible ways. Now, I'd like to share this slide with you. And this was a patient-focused study conducted in 400 consecutive IBD patients in the UK a few years back. And with interviews with 400 patients and survey data indicated that close to 50% of patients felt that diet could initiate their inflammatory bowel disease. And 57% of patients felt that diet could trigger a flare of their disease. 60% reported worsening symptoms with certain foods, and 2/3 of patients deprived themselves of their favorite foods in order to prevent disease relapse. And surprisingly, half of patients did not receive any formal dietary advice. And this is very surprising, I say, because we see that there are multiple roles for diet and nutrition in IBD, including the possibility for its use as primary therapy to induce remission in patients with active disease. And this has been well established in pediatric patients with Crohn's disease, whereby tube feeding or enteral feeding has been used very successfully to induce remission. There are many other phases of nutrition in IBD, including the high risk for malnutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, surgical resections that can lead to high output ileostomies and micronutrient losses, and its possible role as maintenance therapy as well. Now, we have recently published on how environmental triggers, particularly diet, although there are several others as listed on this slide as well, can interact with the microbiome to shape the composition of the bacteria, the function of the bacteria, and can also directly regulate the immune function of the gut and also regulate the immune response through the production of pro and anti-inflammatory cytokines, which can modulate inflammation in the gut. And as Dr. Heller has previously mentioned, we know that this concept of nutrigenomics, how diet and nutrition interact with gene expression, is a really understudied area in inflammatory bowel disease. Although the concept of nutrition and genetics has been well identified to have a role in other disease conditions, including metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. So potentially, diet can work through multiple different ways to have an effect on inflammation in the gut. Now, this was a prospective cohort study, so a study whereby over 45,000 male patients and close to 40,000 female patients from Sweden were followed over a 20-year period to identify what proportion of patients, these were all healthy people at the study inclusion time, and eventually the goals of the study were to identify what proportion of these patients developed inflammatory bowel disease and whether there were any dietary risk factors for IBD. And what they identified here in these in this very big cohort of patients, over this 20-year period, there were 164 new cases of Crohn's disease and close to 400 new cases of ulcerative colitis. These patients completed a food frequency questionnaire that was validated at baseline, so at the time that they were included into this study. And they then had their diet scores classified into how closely they followed a Mediterranean diet. So if they followed a Mediterranean diet very closely, they received a high score, so a score on the far right of 6 to 8. If they were not really following a Mediterranean diet score, they were on the low end of this, 0 to 2. So what you see here is that in patients with Crohn's disease, there were significantly fewer new cases of Crohn's disease identified in patients that had a high adherence to the Mediterranean diet compared to the patients that had a low adherence to the Mediterranean diet. So the Mediterranean diet appeared protective to developing new cases of IBD. However, this was not the case with ulcerative colitis, where no signal was identified for UC. Now, in another large study, over 170,000 women were followed up through the Nurses' Health Study over 26 years. And here, these patients completed food frequency questionnaires whereby they captured dietary data every 4 years. And here they identified 270 new cases of Crohn's disease and 338 new cases of ulcerative colitis. And here they identified that patients that had the highest dietary fiber intake compared to the lowest dietary fiber intake had much fewer cases of Crohn's disease, but again, not ulcerative colitis. But not all fiber was considered equal. The greatest protective effects for fiber were seen with fruits and possibly vegetables, but not grain-based products. Other items that were found to be protective, particularly with Crohn's disease, included legumes and nuts, as well as olive oil. But again, no protective effects seen for diet and UC. Now that is all the background here is with regards to dietary risk factors for new onset of Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. But what about for patients that already have diagnoses of inflammatory bowel disease? Can diet be used to treat as part of the treatment paradigm or the treatment approach to patients with IBD? And 2 years ago in 2019, the first landmark randomized control trial investigating 2 dietary therapies and their ability to induce remission was published. And I'm briefly going to go over that with you shortly. In addition, there have been several other diets that have been also reported upon in the literature. And Dr. Heller has also updated you about the most recent trial data as well. So this Crohn's disease exclusion diet was developed by Dr. Levine and his colleagues several years previously to basically build upon how the various aspects of the environment, particularly diet and the industrialization of food, may through multiple mechanisms impair the microbiome as well as the intestinal integrity, otherwise known as those leaky junctions that in common language people frequently refer to. And so diet has been shown to affect multiple aspects of the pathogenesis of inflammatory bowel disease. And using what has been reported in the literature, the Crohn's disease exclusion diet was developed. Now, this was an interesting study in children with mild to moderate Crohn's disease. And what happened here was that 40 patients were assigned to receive the Crohn's disease exclusion diet, together with 50% of their calories coming from an oral nutrient supplement for 6 weeks. Or they received exclusive enteral nutrition alone, whereby they received only tube-based or oral-based formula, but they could not eat regular food. And then from week 7 to 12, the Crohn's disease exclusion diet had more of their calories coming from the diet and fewer calories coming from the oral nutrient supplement. But patients receiving the exclusive enteral nutrition alone were allowed to resume a regular diet. On the far left, what you see here in the blue represents data for the Crohn's disease exclusion diet, and in the orange represents data from the exclusive enteral nutrition. And what you see here is that at week 12, a significantly greater proportion of patients continued to be in clinical remission in the Crohn's disease exclusion diet compared to the exclusive enteral nutrition group. And in this study, 76% of patients actually normalized their C-reactive protein in the CD/ED group compared to the exclusive enteral nutrition group. And when we look at hard biomarkers of inflammation, such as the fecal calprotectin, we see that in both groups, CD/ED plus exclusive enteral nutrition, fecal calprotectins were quite high, in excess of 3,000 and 2,600 respectively at baseline. But following the 12-week intervention period, there was a significant decline in fecal calprotectin in the CD/ED group that was sustained. But in the exclusive enteral nutrition group, there was a decline, but that rebounded when patients were allowed to reintroduce their regular diet. So the authors concluded that this was the first randomized control trial to compare 2 very effective dietary therapies, with conclusions that diet can modify inflammation. Now, with this in mind, and with other data, including data that have come from our group, the first international organization of IBD dietary guidelines were published last year. And to Dr. Heller's earlier point, these are not personalized. So these recommendations are available as a starting point for any patient that has been diagnosed with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. And for Crohn's disease, the recommendations are for increasing intake of vegetables and fruit, with decreasing intake of saturated and trans fats, and multiple food additives, including emulsifiers, carrageenans, artificial sweeteners, and other items. For ulcerative colitis, the recommendations are for increasing intake of omega-3 oils from fish and food rather than supplements, and decreasing intake of red and processed meats, dairy fat, palm and coconut oil, although keeping in mind the recommendations for these food products really have only come from observational studies or even preclinical studies. So there's a lot more work to do here. Now, we recently have published this IBD food pyramid coming from both our group's research as well as the collective literature's wisdom. And again, at the very base of the food pyramid for both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, we have an emphasis on leafy green vegetables, multicolored fruits and vegetables, resistant starches, homemade meals, elimination of additives and processed foods, healthy proteins from chicken and fish, and few unhealthy fats. So with a focus on monounsaturated and optimal omega-3 to 6 ratios. But again, all of that background is in the context of general recommendations. But we know that IBD as a disease is highly heterogeneous with differing underlying biology across patients. Patients have different gut microbiomes, different genetics, different risk factors, and all of these things can provide differing responses to foods. So precision nutrition is a nutritional plan that in the ideal world should be tailored to the biological, lifestyle, and clinical characteristics of each patient, with a goal of delivering optimal personalized diets based on predicting individual responses to foods. So with advances in scientific technology, we are hoping to be able to measure the personal response to food. And this is enabled through understanding of nutrient interactions with genetics or nutrigenomics, how the bacteria at various levels respond to diet, the concept of metagenomics, what the dietary metabolites and the bacterial metabolites interact with food, so the concept of metabolomics, and how diet directly interacts with the immune system. So the foundation has funded our study titled Modeling Patient Response to a Therapeutic Diet in Crohn's Disease. And our overall aims of our study are to assess whether the various parameters and or changes in these parameters predict response to the Crohn's disease therapeutic dietary index, and TDI is the acronym for the therapeutic dietary intervention study. And then we also hope to develop a predictive model based on these parameters. So at baseline, before patients receive the diet, we collect blood samples, physical activity data, stool samples, and particularly we're interested in the cellular fatty acid percentage in red blood cells. So what are the omega-3 and omega-6 and monounsaturated fatty acid percentages in red blood cells at baseline? And is there any specific combination of these fatty acid percentages that could predict overall response to the diet? Similarly, what is your gene expression like at baseline? And can this predict response to the diet? And what happens to gene cell expression over time after exposure to the diet? We'll capture physical activity intensity by using active PALs and accelerometers, which capture sedentary time, active time, together with other important markers of physical activity, frequency as well as intensity. And we'll also capture data on the microbiome, the metabolome, and other important metabolites. So our overall goals are to evaluate whether the Crohn's disease therapeutic dietary intervention can achieve corticosteroid-free remission, both clinical and biochemical remission, at 14 weeks following dietary intervention, and to quantify the omega-6 to omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acid ratios, monounsaturated fatty acids and saturated fatty acids in the blood to determine whether there's any effect of the diet on regulatory macrophages, so speaking to the immune function, along with assessments on gene expression as well as the microbiome and short-chain fatty acids. So we're going to include patients that have mild to moderate luminal Crohn's disease, so inflammation in the small bowel or in the colon. We're going to exclude patients that have active fistulizing disease. Patients need to have a fecal calprotectin greater than 250, indicating active inflammation to be included. They need to be on stable medications for 2 months. So if they have a new biologic medication introduced, or there's been a change in their biologic medications, they won't be permitted to participate at this point in time. They can have at maximum just 1 small bowel resection, because we know the microbiome changes with multiple surgeries. So we need to be able to control for that. Similarly, antibiotics can interfere with the microbiome, so antibiotics are not permitted within 2 months of recruitment, and patients can't have active infections at the time of recruitment either. So we recently published this paper whereby various dietary components on the left are associated with multiple types of bacteria on the x-axis. So using this, our knowledge here about various foods and food groups, together with the fact that we see that leafy green vegetables are protective to active inflammation as measured through fecal calprotectin, and optimal omega-6 to omega-3 ratios have been identified to overall lower systemic markers of inflammation. So we've used this data to put together the dietary intervention for patients. And the dietary intervention is being delivered by our study dietitian, who is knowledgeable about the diet, together with this lifestyle mobile application that we have developed specifically for patients to utilize in between their dietary visits. So patients will complete their food frequency questionnaires and food recalls with the dietitian using this mobile application. They will get an overall eating score, and then we will provide recommendations to patients that are personalized to the patient depending on their current dietary behaviors. And the diet will be delivered to them using this mobile application in addition to weekly dietitian visits. Patients will also be responsible to track their food consumption and their food data, intake data, because we know that tracking also enables adherence and compliance, which can be challenging in dietary studies. So in conclusion, I'd like to state that diet works, at least in a subset of patients. There's a lot more to diet and nutrition than meets the eye. We have to move beyond standardized diets and aim towards that precision diet for that unique individual, using large data to inform microbiome, metabolomic, and nutrigenomic signatures can also further inform diets with more precision. And we need bioinformaticians and mathematicians to conduct these complex analyses. And also we need strong frontline clinical registered dietitians to assist with the diet delivery, as well as with managing adherence and compliance for optimal outcomes. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Maitri. What a fascinating presentation, and we're really excited about your research and the outcomes it's going to give us. Now I want to move on to introduce Kostas Gerasimides, who is a professor of clinical nutrition at the University of Glasgow. Professor Gerasimides researches the effect of diets and artificial nutritional support on the gut microbiota of children and adults in IBD, and he's going to share his work with us. And I just want to add that there's a little more information on both Dr. Rahman and Dr. Gerasimides on the website that you can take a look at. So, Dr. Gerasimides.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and of course for the invitation to be here today. So as Dr. Heller said, my name is Kostas Gerasimidis. I'm a dietitian actually by trade, and I come from Greece, although I have been in the UK and in Scotland for the last 20 years of my life. And I'm currently a professor of clinical nutrition and dietetics in the University of Glasgow. So I have two main areas of research. One is to identify what in the diet causes inflammatory bowel disease, and the second is to use this information to develop new dietary therapies for Crohn's disease. And this is work and research that have been involved over the last 20 years of my career. So as Dr. Heller said correctly, so the cause of inflammatory bowel disease is not as easy as we have thought back in 2001, where we thought it was a genetic disease. And this is pretty much a figure which highlights the various milestones we have been through in our understanding about the etiology of inflammatory bowel disease. So back in 2001, we thought it was all about the genetics. The paradigm changed in 2010, and we thought it was a bacterium, there was a particular microorganism which caused the illness. But now in 2021, we know that diet is a very important player in the etiology of Crohn's disease. And the current dogma, or the current kind of like example of what causes Crohn's disease, stipulate that it is the interaction between the diet with the gut microbiome in people who are genetically susceptible to develop inflammatory bowel disease. So the best data at the moment we've got that diet is important for patients with inflammatory bowel disease comes from two different sources. So the first one is the perceptions that patients have about the role of diet and the role of dietary therapy in their condition. And these are two of the questionnaire surveys which have carried out. One was performed in the UK, as Dr. Raman told us, and the second one was performed in France. And as you can see from both of these surveys, patients with inflammatory bowel disease highlight the importance of diet as a driver of the disease onset. So as you can see, 48% of the people thought that the diet could initiate inflammatory bowel disease, and this is the study which was performed in France. And as you can see in the other study, this percentage was approximately 26%. So you can see that in both of the studies, patients feel that the diet can trigger a flare. So it's not only important for the disease onset, but it's also important for disease flares. There are certain foods which have associated with worsening of the symptoms. And of course, when people restrict the diet, this has major effects on the social interaction, the quality of life. And of course, people perceptions are often translated to what people actually do. So this is one of the very first studies I published in Glasgow when I was still doing my doctorate research. And what we try to do here, we try to assess the use of dietary therapy, nutritional supplements, and complementary and alternative treatments by Scottish children who had inflammatory bowel disease. And as you can see from this paragraph here, from this table, approximately 61 of our patients were users of complementary and alternative therapy. And no surprise, the most important therapies that the patients were using had to do with nutrition. You could see that a large proportion of the patients were following a dairy-free diet, a gluten-free diet, a low residue diet, a low sugar diet, or they were receiving supplements, including probiotics, fish oils, vitamins, prebiotics, and so on. But it's very important to say that although our patients do that, and our patients believe that these are important supplements or food for the diet, there's very little clinical data to support that this is the case. But there is one treatment which highlights the importance of diet in the management of inflammatory bowel disease, and particularly in the management of Crohn's disease. And this is a dietary therapy which is based on a liquid-only diet. We call this exclusive enteral nutrition. And this is essentially the 5 glasses of this liquid diet that children with active Crohn's disease need to receive on a daily basis for 8 weeks in order for them to have an improvement in the clinical symptoms and an improvement in inflammatory markers. And while you're receiving this liquid diet, a very important condition is that you stop your habitual diet. So essentially, you're replacing your normal diet with this liquid diet for 8 weeks. And although between the States and where I'm based in Europe, we agree pretty much on the way that we should manage patients with Crohn's disease. This is a treatment which kind of like discriminates between the two kind of like continents. In Europe, exclusive enteral nutrition is the primary induction treatment for children with active Crohn's disease. So if you come, for example, to our pediatric hospital in Glasgow, pretty much 95 out of the 100 newly diagnosed children will be treated with exclusive enteral nutrition, where we know very well that this is not the case in the States. And there are very, very few centers which actually use exclusive enteral nutrition as a primary or secondary induction therapy for children with active Crohn's disease. And there are a lot of reasons why this is happening, including, of course, how treatment is reimbursed between Europe, particularly the UK and the United States. And I have to say that the treatment was extremely effective, some of the very expensive biologics. It also improves your nutritional status, and both of our previous speakers discussed the importance of what we call supportive nutrition for patients with inflammatory bowel disease. So what I usually say to my students and my staff, exclusive enteral nutrition is a treatment 2-in-1. Improves your disease activity, but at the same time improves your nutritional status. It works as well as high dosage of oral steroids. It improves your disease activity markers in blood, things like C-reactive protein, albumin levels, or erythrocyte sedimentation rate. And compared to steroids, it also improves mucosal gut healing. And this is something that we know that steroidal treatment cannot actually achieve. And one of the really fascinating aspects about using exclusive enteral nutrition in the management of Crohn's disease, it is that it's probably the only treatment that we've got for Crohn's disease which is side effects free. So it is not associated with any type of side effects, because it's just simply food that you give to participants in a liquid proprietary form. So if you compare exclusive enteral nutrition with the alternative treatment we have in Glasgow for children with active Crohn's disease, and this is high dosage of oral steroids, you can see that the EN has absolutely no side effects, whereas corticosteroids are associated with poor bone health. They increase your blood sugar levels, they can affect your blood pressure, they can affect your growth and your pubertal development if you're a child, they can increase your fatness levels, they can cause peptic ulcers, they can cause edema, they can affect your mood, and of course they can affect also your skin rashes. So there's no kind of like brainer which of this treatment is the preferable choice for the patients. But there is one thing which is very different between exclusive enteral nutrition and the other treatments. As you can imagine, exclusive enteral nutrition is an extremely monotonous, blunt liquid diet that someone has to follow for 8 weeks. And if you try to work out how much volume someone has to consume in order to feel better, in order for his gut to heal, you have pretty much to consume 360 glasses or approximately 120 liters of this blunt diet over a period of 8 weeks. So this is a bit crazy, as I usually say. So we've got a treatment which is so good, it's working so well, it doesn't have any side effects, but it's a treatment that our patients are not able to tolerate. So what is the alternative of that? Okay, so we have a treatment that works, we know the composition of the treatment. So kind of like the $1 million question is, can we actually use the science, understand the composition of this liquid diet and try to understand how and which are the ingredients that in our diet can cause Crohn's disease? And secondly, can we use the science behind the use of exclusive enteral nutrition and develop novel food-based alternative diets which our participants, our patients will be more easy to follow, they will be more tolerable and so forth. So this is what we try to do with this Precision Nutrition Initiative, which is funded generously by the foundation. And our hypothesis is based on this single slide. So this is actually the only slide in which I present some research data, okay? So I hope it is clear to you. I'll just get you through the slides, and if you've got any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them at the end of my presentation. So what you've got here, you've got what we call fecal calprotectin, which is an inflammatory marker of your gut, so it's a fecal marker of your gut inflammation. And as our previous speakers said, a measurement approximately in this area, for example, this is the mean or the median, as we call it, concentration of fecal calprotectin in children with active Crohn's disease before they start the liquid diet. You can see they have approximately a mean concentration of 1,500 units. And as you can see, this is the red line. Okay, so this is the red line, what we consider as the normal levels of fecal calprotectin. And you can see what is happening during the 8 weeks of this liquid-only diet. So you have a significant decline in the concentration of this gut inflammatory marker, which means that as your symptoms are getting better, as your blood markers are improving, you're also experiencing a resolution of your gut inflammation, and this, of course, coincides with mucosal healing. So we know this for quite some time, and we were actually the first group which published that in Glasgow back in 2011. But in this study that we published 2 years ago, we have actually realized that when our patients complete this 8 week of liquid diet and they go back to their normal habitual diet, it takes them only 17 days to have a relapse, to have a recurrence of their colonic inflammation, and this fecal marker of disease to revert pretty much to the baseline levels. So although it takes you 8 weeks to bring your fecal calprotectin level down to normal levels, think about that, it takes only 2.5 weeks to lose this effect. But from a scientific point of view, this is really important information, because actually it gives us a lot of interest to try to interrogate these 17 days of food introduction and try to work out what are the food components that the participants consume, which are the differences between the patients whose fecal calprotectin levels increased after the end of exclusive enteral nutrition compared to the patients whose fecal calprotectin levels remained low. And this is pretty much what we try to achieve with this precision nutrition initiative funded by the foundation. So these are our primary outcomes. So the primary outcome is to understand, to characterize the diet of children with Crohn's disease immediately after the end of exclusive enteral nutrition and during the early phase of food introduction. We are also interested as a secondary objective to understand how these putative dietary triggers interact with the gut bacteria and the immune system. And the last secondary objective of this study is to look whether CD3, which is an ordinary food-based diet that we developed with my team here in Glasgow, could actually control this recurrence of fecal calprotectin during food reintroduction. So this is what we call a randomized control trial, which essentially means that we get a number of patients and you randomly allocate them to 2 treatments. So we are hoping to run what we call a 7-center, multi-center randomized control trial. So we are hoping to recruit 60 participants, accounting that some of them may actually need to drop out. And the participants, as I told you before, will be randomly allocated to either CD3, which is the diet we devised and we are kind of testing in Glasgow as an induction treatment for Crohn's disease, versus the unrestricted feed diet of the patients. We have also a matched group of healthy controls that we use them kind of like as a benchmark of the normal of what we call the healthy gut microbiome. The study is called intensive. Okay, it's an intensive post-exclusive enteral nutrition study because we collect a large number of samples and a lot of data information over a very short period of time. So we are recruiting children who have just finished their standard of care, as we call the regular course of exclusive enteral nutrition. We collect some stool samples at this point, and then our participants collect stool samples pretty much every 3rd day during the 21-day intervention, and they're recording their diet pretty much every day. As I told you before, our participants are randomized to do different interventions. One is the CD3 diet, and the other one is the other group will receive kind of like the standard dietary free diet. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Crohn's disease with the CD3 diet, this is what we call the Crohn's disease treatment with eating. This is a dietary therapy that was published a couple of years ago in gastroenterology, in the top journal in its field. And it's a diet which has similar nutrient and food ingredient composition with exclusive vital nutrition and induces the same effects on the gut microbiome. So this is pretty much how we took this liquid diet and we kind of like we try to reverse engineer it and produce a stable, a normal food-based diet, which will have the same kind of like ingredients in terms of amount of carbohydrates, fat, micronutrients, the amount of glucose, amount of fiber, gluten, and lactose. And of course, the aim was that this diet will induce the same changes on the gut bacteria with the exclusive vital nutrition. And we've done quite a lot of preclinical research. We tested this diet in healthy people. We tested this diet in animals who have gut inflammation as a model of Crohn's disease. And we have also run a very small pilot study in which we test this diet in children with active Crohn's disease. And I have to say that the results we obtained from this previous research and from our ongoing research are very encouraging. So what is CD3 and how it looks like? This is CD3 when it's packed and it's ready for delivery. As I told you, what we try in this study, we try to give patients CD3, and because we don't want patients to cook their own meals, because of course this it's quite cumbersome for the participants, and because we want to make sure that the participants follow the diet as much as possible, and we want to remove any kind of like a financial burden for them. So we have subcontracted a catering company which prepares and cooks the meal for us, and the meals are all delivered to the patient's doorstep. So these are how the meals are looking when they are packed, and these are the meals, how they look when the meals are actually ready to be consumed. So you can see here we've got various sandwiches, we've got the meatball pasta, we've got cordon and rice, we've got, I think this is chicken with tomato and lettuce, and we've got macaroni cheese and so forth. So as you can see, compared to this liquid only diet, in our eyes, this is a much better improvement in the dietary therapy of Crohn's disease. Of course, we have the other group, which has to stay on the unrestricted diet. And because we didn't want to disadvantage this group, because remember, the CD3 group gets all these meals free of charge and ready for them to be consumed. So we decided that our control group should have the opportunity to order online food free. So in the UK, and particularly in Scotland, we have a supermarket which is called Morrison's. So we have created accounts for each of our patients, so the patients can go, log in, and can order the food they want to consume. Okay, and we keep kind of like a record of this order, which will help us essentially to assess the diet of these participants when it comes to the point of the analysis. So we collect a lot of stool samples, and I cannot think of any other study in the literature which collects pretty much 8 samples per participant over a period of 21 days. So to facilitate this process, we provide to our patients small domestic freezers, and this was really a good idea, trust me. And we also give them some rewards. So for every stool sample they give us, we give them a £20 Amazon voucher. So this is how the recruitment of the study goes at the moment. So we, as I told you, these are figures from 2 sites. So we have recruited 21 participants, 11 were, all of them are of course children with Crohn's disease. And these were the 11 children who were randomized. 6 of them were CD3, 5 of them on normal diet. Some of them are still on the trial, and we recruit also some healthy controls. And I have to say that as pandemic is getting much better in the UK, we are allowed to recruit more and more participants. Although we collect a lot of stool samples, I have to say this is probably one of the most popular studies I have ever run in my group for the last 20 years. So at the moment we haven't had any dropout, and every single participant gives us all the stool samples, and as I told you before, they record the diet on a daily basis for these 21 days of the intervention. So originally we started the study in Glasgow, and then of course with the funding of the foundation we're able to expand the study in 4 other centers, and recently in 2 more. So we've got at the moment 7 hospitals across Scotland, pretty much every single pediatric service which is recruiting for our study. And we have also some other news. We have the potential to extend the study, not just in Scotland, but as we say, from north to the south. So we have the opportunity to extend the study from 7 centers to 11 centers and increase our recruitment number from 60 to 120. So what does this study mean for patients with Crohn's disease? So we are aiming to answer 3 very important questions. First of all is, what are the dietary triggers of gut inflammations and how these dietary triggers, how these dietary components interact with the gut bacteria of people with Crohn's disease and their immune system? So we're also hoping to answer one of the most popular questions that patients and their family members ask us in the clinical service. What should patients with Crohn's disease avoid to eat in order to prevent a future flare? And of course, a minor secondary aim of this study is also to explore whether CD3 is an effective food reintroduction protocol in patients who had been induced in remission following treatment with the liquid diet only. So I'm the principal investigator of this study, but there are a lot of other people to acknowledge. These are the people in our group in Glasgow. So we've got amazing clinical team across all the 7 centers. We've got lab people who are working with us. And of course, we very much appreciate and we're extremely grateful of all the support we have received from the foundation. And of course, for all of you guys who support the objectives of the foundation. Next slide. I'd like to close my presentation and I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Kostas. What a fascinating talk, and really eager to see whether you can replicate that EN with real food and really good outcomes. That'll be great to see. So we have I think till 1:40 for questions and answers. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce 2 other members of this panel who are critical to really the success of all of our research efforts at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. 2 scientists, Dr. Andres Hurtado Lorenzo, who is our VP for Translational Research Initiatives, and Gerard Honig, who is our Associate Director for Research Innovation. And Andres and Gerard were really instrumental in conceiving what the precision nutrition initiative was going to look like, and in sort of getting people to apply and reviewing the proposals. So glad to have them on board to help answering any questions that might come up. So I'm supposed to remind you that you need to put the questions, let's say, in the chat box at any time, and so we will get to as many questions as we can. So Harriet, are you gonna help with reading questions and doing all of that? That would be great. Thank you.
And we have received a lot of great questions. So thank you first to everyone for your thoughtful and attentive listening and for all the great questions you sent. Our first question comes from Amy Temple, and she asks, are there any diet recommendations to reduce the risk of pouchitis for UC patients who had J-pouch surgery? And I'll just put that out to the panel and you all can decide amongst yourselves who best to address that.
Why don't we have you start with that?
Who did you say, Caren? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Matri.
Great.
Kostas, you want to answer it, or?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, the answer is no, we don't have.
So Matri, maybe you have some more information on that.
Well, we were just writing a paper just imminently, which is why this paper resonates with me right now, but I'm only aware of one study that has investigated diet as a treatment option for pouchitis. And what the investigators identified was that higher consumption, particularly of fruits, appeared to be protective towards decreased inflammation. So in terms of what that looks like, what types of fruits, what frequency of fruits, should they be peeled, should they be, de-seeded? I don't know that we have those types of information to be able to confidently talk about recommendations with precision, but I think probably, emphasizing fruits as part of your diet could be helpful.
And can I just mention something else? So, of course, probiotics are considered what we call food-grade bacteria, and there is some evidence to suggest that certain probiotic cocktail may actually prevent the relapse or the new onset of pouchitis. And I think these certain probiotic cocktails are actually supported by various guidelines across the world.
So our next comment actually is just that this information needs to go out to nutritionists. There's so many of them that don't know as much about working with these diseases. So I think that's just noted for the holistic mission side of the organization and the way that we partner with clinicians and others in the health professional community.
And I just want to say, Harriet, that we are doing more and more with like, you know, nutritionists and societies. And so we will, when we have sort of the definitive information to really spread to them and with them, we will definitely be working with them on that. Absolutely.
Fantastic. And then someone just commented how important this work is because how hard it is to follow the EN. So just echoing what Kostas shared with us. The next question comes from Kathleen Merrill, and she says, in looking at the Nurses Health study and IBD being associated with lower fiber intake, isn't it possible that participants with IBD consumed less fiber because fiber bothers them? So is it a sort of chicken and egg thing? In other words, maybe they didn't develop IBD because of eating less fiber. Maybe they were eating less fiber because they had IBD pre-diagnosis. Anyway, she just shares, there's a lot of moms have stories of trying to force their kids to eat fiber and then finding out they have IBD and that the fiber actually hurts and they feel guilty about that. So just wondering if there's any information in the data about that.
Yeah, that's an excellent, excellent point. Absolutely. I think the important thing to keep in mind with the Nurses Health study is that they followed healthy people for 26 years. So it was really long-term follow-up, and they had food frequency questionnaires completed every 4 years. So I think that now I don't believe with this study they excluded sort of lead time bias. In other studies they have. So what that meant was they some previous studies they didn't include the results of patients that developed IBD within up to 2 years of starting the study. So that way you can confidently say that patients developed IBD at a later time point. So they weren't necessarily modifying their diet to reduce fiber because they were symptomatic. So I don't think this study did that. But having said that, I still think with 26 years of follow-up, probably this is a real finding. And that also has been replicated in other much smaller prospective studies. So it's a great point, but I think there is something to the fiber story that hopefully this work will identify.
Kostas, go ahead.
Yes, so just to add of what Dr. Rahman said, one of the things that you have always to bear in mind is that you have to distinguish sometimes between diet causing disease with diet treating disease. Because, for example, you've got here an example that we believe that the high fiber intake is protecting people from developing Crohn's disease, particularly fiber which comes from fruits. But if you think about exclusive enteral nutrition, is a fiber-free diet and actually makes patients better. So you've got a little bit of a paradox. So sometimes one of the arguments that I make with people is really wrong to use dietary factors or dietary components which are associated with disease onset and use this for treatment. For example, many people have said that food additives are really bad for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis based on preclinical evidence, on animal models, on cell lines. But actually, exclusive enteral nutrition has in total 58 different food additives, including maltodextrin, carrageenans, carboxymethylcellulose, and it's still working very well. So it's very important to distinguish between diet causing disease and diet as a regimen to treat illness.
Yeah, so that actually hits upon something else that Kathleen Merrill shared, which is the power of enteral diets always mystifies me because no fiber, no fruit, no veggies. Most of these drinks have so many additives and emulsifiers, and yet it's just weird and fascinating. I've always thought of it as bowel rest. So that's just a comment sort of in the mix of.
Just to make a comment here, if you have exclusive enteral nutrition on a daily basis, you consume 150 grams of maltodextrin. Okay, no healthy regular person will consume on the normal habitual diet so much maltodextrin, but you're still getting better and your gut inflammation is improving. Okay, so we wrote a couple of papers that are published in the literature. Last year, we challenged all this perception of people of how bad food additives are. We don't say that food additives are not bad, but we say that those that we think are bad most likely are not. There may be other ones that we have not investigated there yet.
And just to add to that, I think that was an excellent point from Dr. Kostos. My other thought here, and something we don't always talk about that frequently, is that patients with inflammatory bowel disease, particularly small bowel disease with Crohn's, are at really high risk of multiple micronutrient deficiencies. And we have, and this has been replicated and identified time and again. So the beauty of exclusive enteral nutrition to me is that really we address a lot of these nutrient gaps. So patients with Crohn's disease frequently avoid food groups, or they restrict their diet significantly to the point that they are at risk of not just malnutrition, but particularly micronutrient deficiencies. But we don't measure these, and we don't have great ways to measure these to identify what nutrients, micronutrients they are at risk for. So enteral nutrition is a way to overcome or circumnavigate that deficiency in nutrients. And we really don't know what the relationship between micronutrient deficiencies and onset of inflammation really is. So, I mean, and that is sort of a hypothesis for us too. With this study, we won't be able to answer that question, but I think future work needs to look at micronutrient deficiencies and what correcting these can do in terms of modifying the inflammatory course.
Could I just add on this point that we have just published a paper in Clinical Nutrition which showed that actually plasma zinc, so if you are deficient in plasma, it's a much better predictor of your time to relapse than CRP, calprotectin, and albumin. So, you know, there's a lot of interest about that. It was published a year ago. It attracted a lot of attention, and we're very much interested in micronutrients in Glasgow. We published about 5-6 papers in this area, and agree entirely with Dr. Rahman. This is a very interesting area of further research.
Sort of touching on that, we have a question from Nancy Muldowney, and it says, my question is around diet and severe anemia, pain, and loss of appetite in general for those in a flare with UC. Do the enteral feeds address the anemia and help improve that, as well as the actual electrolyte loss? So just don't know if you have any additional comments there.
Exclusive enteral nutrition does not work, to the best of our knowledge, for patients with active ulcerative colitis. So we will never use EN for the management of active ulcerative colitis. But someone who's got an active kind of like refractory ulcerative colitis may receive nutrition support. So essentially we still use EN, but not to improve disease outcomes, but because we want to nutrition rehabilitate them. So this is very important. Please don't go back to your clinicians and tell them, Kostas told us we can use exclusive enteral nutrition for the management of ulcerative colitis. I have never said that. Okay, but you can still use some of these enteral nutrition feeds to support your muscles, your micronutrient status, and this is pretty much what I summarized in one of my slides. So we use enteral nutrition as therapy, but also as supportive kind of like a regimen.
So Harry, can I ask a question? Because what I've noticed in the work that you presented, that it seems that Crohn's disease seems to be much more susceptible to food interventions than ulcerative colitis. So I'm curious whether you have any hypotheses that to explain that difference.
I can go ahead, Dr.
No, Matey, please, ladies first.
So that's a really interesting question. And I just wanted to also just echo Dr. Kostas's previous point about exclusive enteral nutrition being best studied in particularly small bowel Crohn's disease, even although there is some impact or effectiveness even in colonic Crohn's disease. But you're absolutely right, Dr. Heller, that even the prospective cohort studies do show a benefit for diet in some way for Crohn's, but not so much ulcerative colitis. I don't have any, I guess, strong data, but a hypothesis would be that the immune-mediated mechanisms of action potentially are different in Crohn's disease as well as ulcerative colitis. And also, like, most of the microbiome studies so far in IBD have really been fecal microbiome or stool microbiome. We haven't yet really, I feel, explored the role of the mucosal microbiome. So I think, and of course, that's really challenging practically because we can't always do colonoscopies on everybody, and we would need to do that in order to sample the microbiome from small bowel as well as the colon. But a hypothesis would be that the mucosal microbiome in small bowel versus large bowel is different, and that potentially could drive some of that dietary response.
Yeah. I think that if I'm not mistaken, your question, Dr. Heller, is why we have more interest in Crohn's disease compared with UC. Is that right?
So it seems that there's more response to food, like a beneficial response to food.
Okay.
In Crohn's disease than ulcerative colitis.
Yeah, I think that, yes, perhaps this has to do also with the fact that we study more the topic of nutrition in Crohn's disease than in ulcerative colitis at the moment. And perhaps one of the reasons this is happening is because of the experience we have developed with the exclusive enteral nutrition. So you have here a treatment that you know that is working in patients with active Crohn's disease. So you immediately realize that most likely for this population diet is important, but we don't have another kind of like established dietary therapy for UC. I think, in my opinion, this is why we've got a bit more kind of like research in Crohn's disease in diet as opposed to ulcerative colitis, but definitely there is a lot of interest at the moment in the community to develop dietary therapies for ulcerative colitis. And whenever we discuss that in Europe, in what we call the European Crohn's and Colitis Organization, I used to be kind of like in the dietetic group, we believe that there are different dietary components which are beneficial or harmful for Crohn's disease as opposed to ulcerative colitis. For example, fiber, okay, so there are 27 randomized controlled trials in IBD, all of them which used fiber-based supplementation in Crohn's disease have failed, but approximately 30% of them worked in ulcerative colitis. So this is important. Same also with probiotics. All probiotic trials failed in Crohn's disease, but you've got approximately 4 or 5 trials which say that selective probiotics may be beneficial to moderate a mild ulcerative colitis. So what works for one disease, I don't think that necessarily works for the other.
So just a reminder, we have about 7 minutes left for questions, so you're welcome to type them in. I still have quite a few here on our list. The next one comes from Chris Henley, our chapter president in the Mid-America chapter. He says, this presentation on food and data, then all the data is and its impact is priceless. It's very valuable because it's obviously such a huge factor in IBD. But that said, I no longer have a large intestine. So eating some of the foods suggested are not digested well or causes other issues or aren't absorbed in time. So just curious, should we still try and stick to those dietary recommendations, or does it change when some of us have had these corrective surgeries that change our microbiome?
So I think that's a great question. And I think it goes back to an earlier point I tried to make, that IBD truly is very heterogeneous. So people can have multiple surgeries and to a point whereby they have reduced amount of small intestine, leading towards short bowel syndrome. And short bowel syndrome presents its own nutrition challenges, which are more related to malabsorption, dehydration, micronutrient imbalances. Malnutrition is a big issue for people that have had multiple small bowel resections. Perhaps in my experience, I manage our home antral and parenteral nutrition program as well. And I see that patients that have had multiple small bowel resections usually don't tend to have as active inflammatory disease. So in a scenario whereby you've had prior bowel resections and you don't have active disease, then I would say the recommendations are different. So this discussion that we're having now is more related to how do we use diet or dietary components to reduce inflammation or manage inflammation or maintain remission in patients that have had active disease. But I think your question is more related to, okay, I have stable Crohn's disease, but I've had multiple resections, so now what do I eat? So I think that's a different question than what we're talking about now.
Okay, the next question is from Wendy Goldberg, and she asks, do you mind telling me if fiber supplements are not recommended for Crohn's disease, whether or not fiber supplements would be recommended for Crohn's disease?
Oh, if you, I don't think we have the answer to this question, but my personal opinion, without influencing anyone's kind of like decision on what they will do, I would say that if I had Crohn's disease, and based on the data that some people have published and the data we generate from Glasgow, I would avoid fiber from certain food. Yeah. So
anyone else want to add to that? Or we have a kind of a follow-on question that's somewhat related, which is, I'll ask it and then you can answer any part of that question. But the next question is, does the CD Treat diet have gluten in it? I'm just curious because that photo showed a lot of pasta and bread. What was the key to developing the diet? What is the mix of macronutrients? Could you talk a bit more about the diet?
Absolutely. So CD Treat is lactose-free, is gluten-free because this is what EN is. It has also the same macronutrients as exclusive enteral nutrition, because as I told you from the beginning of my presentation, we try to simulate the nutrient composition as well as the food ingredient composition of exclusive enteral nutrition. So pretty much 95% of the enteral feeds we use for the management of active Crohn's disease are gluten and lactose free. So we try to simulate that. And the majority of them, if not all of them, are fiber free. So again, CD Treat has a very low amount of fiber, something like 6 to 8 grams per day, and is what we call nutritionally complete because it gives you all the macronutrients that you require, and it's the amount that you receive with exclusive enteral nutrition.
I can just go back to the fiber question for a moment. So in a recent study that we just published in the Journal of Crohn's and Colitis, we identified that in patients that were consuming higher dietary intake of fiber compared to lower dietary intake of fiber, they had a more favorable, if you will, microbiome composition. So they had fewer of those bad or toxic bacteria coming from the Proteobacteria phyla, and they had more of the butyrate or sort of healthier Faecalibacterium genus level bacteria in those people that were consuming higher amounts of fiber. But that study was really more looking at the effects, whether you can change the microbiome based on diet. We didn't look necessarily, and this was in a group of patients that were in remission. So here we can say that fiber was well tolerated and there was a significant positive impact on the microbiome, but I don't think we can extrapolate just yet. We just don't have the data to show or to say that this was associated with lower inflammation. I think we need a different study design to be able to answer that question.
And before you speak, Costas, I also want to ask the question, do you think there's a difference between fiber supplements and eating more fruits and vegetables?
Absolutely, and this is what I want to touch. So we've got at the moment a paper under review, which we don't know if it's going to be accepted or not. Hopefully, yes. So we saw that post-EN, the major dietary triggers of Crohn's disease relapse in terms of fecal protectin rise was fiber and butyrate. And there was a strong correlation between fiber and butyrate because obviously bacteria break down fiber to produce butyrate. So we've got two biomarkers which tell us that if you have a high concentration of butyrate and fiber when you go from EN to your normal diet, this increases your calprotectin levels. But we are very skeptical, so we don't say that fiber and butyrate are bad. It can be just biomarkers of food we consume in which these ingredients appear. For example, if you consume a lot of fiber, you may consume, for example, a lot of cereals, and in cereals, there's a lot of baker's yeast. So there's quite a lot of literature that baker's yeast, for example, is associated with the onset of Crohn's disease. So what we're, at the moment we're doing, this is all based on association, as we say, studies. So we measure a signal, and we have at the moment prognostic markers to tell us who's going to get a flare. But these association studies cannot establish causation. So we cannot say, for example, that high butyrate and high fiber can cause Crohn's disease. So it could be something in the foods which, as I told you, for example, could be the gluten in the cereals. So actually what we measure here with the fiber is the fact that the patients with a lot of fiber, they eat a lot of cereals, and the cereals have got gluten and so forth.
And if I can add to that too, and I think we're probably going to be saying the same thing, but in different words. Fiber, this is one of the big challenges with dietary studies, because we can think that this is a fiber-rich food, but a fiber-rich food is also accompanied by multiple other phytochemicals. So, for example, green leafy vegetables, of course, it has fiber in it, but it also contains beta carotenes, and it contains other micronutrients, folate, and other, among other things that also could have an active role to play in the mitigation of inflammation. Same with fruits and vegetables and legumes. So these things all travel together. So doing simple dietary histories, I think the community would conclude that is probably inadequate, and this has to be married together with more objective markers that can come from using metabolomics and other more objective measures of dietary consumption.
So I want to just, we have two more questions we're going to get in here. The first is a comment for Caren and team, which is, will the foundation be updating their nutrition brochure to reflect all these updated studies and all this info? And then also, it'd be great to get this information out to schools and colleges as well, in addition to the nutritionists, just because that's where a lot of kids are getting information. So I'll just leave those with you, Caren. And then I wanted to ask, this last question came from Lisa Schutzman. My daughter was told to go on a low FODMAP diet, but she gets constipated. Is there anything that she can do about that?
So low FODMAP diet is an interesting diet, but I mean, there have been a couple of low FODMAP diets in IBD specifically. And it's important to keep in mind that 30% of patients with IBD will also suffer from IBS overlap. And the best evidence for low FODMAP diet is in people that have irritable bowel syndrome symptoms. But low FODMAP diet has not been shown to be effective to improve the inflammatory course in IBD. So low FODMAP diets, when delivered by a really skilled dietitian, can be fiber sufficient. But you know, if people are sort of looking at the internet and trying to incorporate a low FODMAP diet, I would just have concern about the nutritional sufficiency, including fiber.
Wonderful. And I'm, with that, going to let Dr. Caren Heller have the last closing word on this fascinating presentation that you all have shared and all the information.
Well, I want to thank you, Harriet, for giving us this opportunity to have this panel, and Costas and Natri for your presentations, and Andres and Gerard for working with me so that we could get funding to support precision nutrition, because clearly it is such an important topic. We're at the beginning of understanding it, and it has such potential to have impact on the lives of improving the quality of lives of patients with IBD. So we are just thrilled with this initiative and hope we can do more. So thank you all.
Thank you. And at this time, we're going to take a 15-minute break. We will reconvene, or 10 minutes, excuse me, 12 minutes. We've gone over a little bit.